Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokmariola. In a world where humans often betray humanity, peace is often elusive and the war is rarely conclusive, creating some of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. From South Sudan to Burundi, Central African Republic to the Democratic Republic of Congo, thousands are forced to flee their homes every day and bear the brunt of a conflict that continues to defy logic. Well, so we ask, what are your thoughts on the plight of refugees in Africa and around the world? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC Connect. A report now to launch the program, and Africa Today will be right back. Welcome on board.
Aisha Khalidou is a mother of 3 who is currently preoccupied with how to feed her kids, provide shelter and medical care for them. She fled her home in Bama, Borno State, when the community was attacked by Boko Haram. Aisha is one of the 15,000 internally displaced persons who are presently residing in Lagos, Nigeria's southwest.
Almost 27 local governments, when we are just managing, we just take this one, put this here, and put this one. So please, we are just appealing to the federal government or the state government to give us the place to be managing. And some people, they don't even have something to eat.
About 1.8 million people have been displaced in the northeast from the 6-year-old insurgency in the region. Thousands of refugees from other African countries are also seeking asylum in the country. Nigeria ranks 3rd in the list of countries experiencing humanitarian crisis globally. Now, the UN Refugee Agency is concerned about this development and is partnering with other agencies to seek a lasting solution to the crisis.
Altogether, the government of Nigeria and the humanitarian need to work to improve access to health in the area. But this is also linking to the security situation. To be able to work and to live peacefully, security have to be achieved in those areas. And this is one of the main challenges now.
Victims of children and women trafficking belong to the category of returning refugees and IDPs in their need of reintegration and protection.
We've been able to benchmark punishment with the new law, where traffickers are now sent to prison without option of fine.
The World Refugee Day 2017 aims to assuage the sufferings of people who were forced to leave their homes because of war. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees continues with the global campaign of drawing international attention to the plight of the displaced because it believes that all refugees and IDPs deserve to live in safety. Its call to action is, let's stand together with refugees and IDPs.
Welcome back. On December the 4th, 2000, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution proclaiming that, with effect from 2001, June the 20th, should be marked as World Refugee Day. In the last 2 decades, millions of refugees and internally displaced persons have been forced to flee their homes, ensuring that Africa stands out as a case study for global observers. Joining me in the studio on Africa Today, I have Dr. Dokun Adedeji, a medical doctor and a public health consultant. Good to have you here on the program.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Right, and on Skype, I have Mark Yarnell, a senior advocate of Refugee International in the United States. Good to have you, Mark, on the program.
Great, thanks for having me.
Right, let's begin the show with you, Dr. Dokun. What is responsible now for the rising cases of refugee crisis, especially in Africa?
Of course, the wars, the various wars, and then the poverty level of the people and the strife within the civilian population. And then that causes a kind of unrest that sends people away scampering for where to find safety and shelter, and then where to find a bit of comfort. Until we do away with those kind of things in Africa, it will be difficult. And also this is due to bad leadership, conflicts that are not necessarily political differences that cannot be resolved, and then leading on to wars.
And this is a usual occurrence in Africa. Is this something so difficult that we cannot handle by ourselves rather than allowing this to fester and cause a crisis like this?
No, it's not that we can't, but you see, there's something that is wrong with us with leadership in Africa. If you look, for instance, Muhammad, there's this gentleman who instituted a prize for leadership. People who've been in leaders, civilian leaders, who've done very well and then who can win the war. We haven't had any awardee in the last 3, 4, 5 years amongst African leaders. You see, I think, for what I have always said, I think the perquisites of office for African leaders is too much. And then the lack of willingness to leave power. I mean, there are term limits, and then before you know what is happening, they're trying to extend the term limit to have constitutional referendum to change. Those things are absolutely unnecessary. Do your term, do the things you need to do, and leave.
In other words, so to prevent things like this from happening.
Absolutely.
And other situations at all that is not so pleasant to see. Well, let me quickly get Mark's view now. Mark, one of the plight of refugees is a struggle to adapt to life, a new life in a new society. Now, what is the usual process when caring for these ones?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge, I guess, for all the difficulty in Africa right now, whether it's South Sudanese fleeing into Uganda, or Somalis who are displaced, or even people in northeast Nigeria who are displaced. It's really remarkable that in most cases, neighboring countries to that which in conflict are keeping their borders open. And so I think we also, as dire as the situation is, it's really important to remember the good things that African governments are doing, whether it's Uganda allowing in South Sudanese refugees, or Ethiopia letting in refugees from Somalia and South Sudan. So just to see that there's also some good things happening. So you know, the traditional situation is when refugees flee in large numbers into a neighboring country. Usually the UN Refugee Agency works with the host government to set up systems to provide support to those who are fleeing for their lives. Traditionally, the focus has been on setting up camps, providing food distributions. People live in tents. But something we're seeing that's been positive, and that's really important, I think, to recognize on World Refugee Day, is there's more and more trends towards allowing refugees freedom of movement, to integrate into local communities, and to use services that already exist in local communities, and to support those services externally, rather than setting up a scenario where someone is stuck in a tent for years on end and receiving food distribution. So there's some things that are moving in a good direction.
And despite the global observation of the World Refugee Day, are the refugees truly now getting the help they require? What can you tell us about the situation on ground?
Well, I mean, something that is, despite some improvements in policies, there's no question that the needs far outstrip the available resources. So in terms of enough funding coming in, whether it's supporting Somalis who live in Dadaab, or Burundis who have fled to the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, when we visit those areas, even though they're getting some support, there's always gaps in services, and especially around education. I mean, I think a huge gap is when people flee their country, and especially half of all current refugees are children, and when they leave their country and are essentially, you know, out of school till they can return, the least we can do is to set up education systems, but that seems to be kind of a last, you know, there's a focus on food, on shelter, and healthcare, understandably, but education often gets left behind. So that's a real concern, is for those that are refugees for years on end, we need to make sure there's adequate educational support so that there's more opportunities once they're able to return home.
And Dr. Dokun, Mark rightly said, indeed, so much the refugees really need at this point, even though the help comes in. But what other areas do you think the help can be provided? He's mentioned education, he's mentioned health. Okay. What other areas do you think the refugees really need help?
One of the areas is resettling them, getting them certain conducive habitation where they can live near to close to normal lives. Those are some of the things that they will need. And also the warmth, comfort of fellowship, when they can move around and then they can relate with other people and they assimilate into the society they've gone to until they can return to their own country. Sometimes they can return, but would they be treated like equal citizens with other people with respect and dignity that they deserve? They are not tangible things, but they are things that are important to them. Because if they are treated as foreigners, it's difficult for them to be assimilated and for the thing that David has said to be provided, education. Who comes to work there? Who stays with them? Who provides the healthcare and all those other facilities?
Quite a point there, but let's quickly go on a break. You're watching Africa Today, and we have been looking at the plight of refugees in Africa and around the world. Stay with us for more after this break. Welcome back. According to a recent report by the United Nations Refugee Agency, more than 65 million people were forcefully displaced worldwide at the end of 2016, about 300,000 more than the previous year. On average, 20 people were driven from their homes every minute last year. That is 1 in every 3 seconds, less than the time it took me to read this sentence. Well, let me bring back Mark Yarnell, who joins me from United States via Skype. Mark, now with what you said earlier on, one of the world's fastest growing refugee settlements is in Uganda, no doubt. And this has a progressive and generous open-door policy to the refugees. But what are your thoughts now on this development, and how do you think this would help the growing refugee crisis?
Well, I mean, at the moment, and for the past number of years, Uganda has really served as an example of very, I think, forward-leaning, progressive refugee policy, wherein, as you mentioned, they keep their borders open, they promote refugees to have the right to work, to access local schools and health centers. And so long as that situation is viable, I think it's a much better situation for people who have really, been quite in quite a difficult spot in terms of fleeing South Sudan. The challenge is that the situation in South Sudan is not getting any better, and you still have hundreds, if not thousands, of people crossing into Uganda per day. And if Uganda does not receive the external support that it needs to, despite its progressive policies, I mean, it could get to a breaking point. And it's hard to predict how bad it could get, but I think that, as open as they're being, at some point, there just won't be enough access to services and to schools and to healthcare, and then you might end up with a pretty massive humanitarian crisis.
All right, let's look at hygiene, Dr. Dokun. Hygiene, we know, is a major concern for these refugees, especially in camps. Now, in Kenya, it was reported in April that the Dadaab camp confirmed its first case of measles, and this also puts the health community, the host community, and the camp at risk. Now, what are your thoughts on the level of medical response to the vulnerable groups, and how do you think this can be handled?
You know, I think Mark said something. Most of these countries are stretched to elastic limits, to a breaking point. They themselves are still struggling with their own local domestic issues. And then when there's a high influx of people, there's no place provided for those kind of people as a camp to expect them and where the facilities are. And so when they come, makeshift camps are made, and then meeting up with the provision of those facilities to cater to hygiene will be difficult. I mean, then what usually happens is there's congestion, people
struggle for space.
Struggle for space, and then before you can get those facilities in there, the sanitary facilities, they then begin to do all the kind of things they shouldn't normally do. And then that gives room to a bit likelihood of infection and then an easy spread. And what then it means is that since this is a low cost of spread, and then it can get to people who come from the society, the residents themselves to get in and then transfer it. So that can also lead to a bit of antagonism. Foreigners are here, they come with their troubles, and then they're inflicting the same on us. That is why the fundamental causes should be looked at to prevent those kind of things. Nobody prepares for absolutely for refugees, but when they come, they're sudden and there's a massive influx.
So how can we, these groups now, indeed they are vulnerable, but the concern about their hygiene in these camps, how can it be addressed so that you do not have a problem, too much to handle? I mean, children, for instance, born into situations like that, how can they be taken care of?
The thing that there must be enough resources. I mean, if the resources are there and if help comes adequately as it should come, it can be done. But the thing is, each nation worldwide is trying to provide for its own domestic population. And when those things happen, I mean, look at what is happening now. America says they're not going to send so much aid, international aid to other countries. And that country was a massive contributor to those countries. And when those kind of contributions begin to diminish, and then the nation itself that is struggling, we need to get out of its zone to do. And so it becomes difficult. But the thing is, if the camps are set up, then we must make makeshift efforts to contain those things. And then try as much as possible to have as many more camps, and then maybe spread them out and then give them the facilities that are necessary. Without that, it will be difficult. Resources.
All right. Now, Mark, looking at a situation where there are speculations that the religious background of some of these refugees may affect, well, to an extent, the level of support they need to survive, is that truly the case?
You mean in specific contexts, or
In general.
I mean,
Well,
I think
well,
that,
in a general context, but particularly religious background, do you think it has any role to play in the level of support they need to survive?
I mean, it shouldn't. You know, maybe beyond religion, one thing that we're noticing, especially for Somalis who arrive in Dadaab, as you mentioned, the case of measles and where there's not enough support. You know, whether someone is part of a majority clan or a minority clan can impact the support they receive from other refugees in the camp. So beyond the external support people receive, it really makes a difference if, when they come across the border into a new country, if they're able to find a community that can be, you know, supportive of everyone in that community, people are better off. But if they're from a minority group, then often they're left on their own, and they're unable to benefit from the cooperative aspect of that. So whether it's religion or ethnicity or clan, we do see incidents where being a minority status impacts the amount of services you receive.
And how likely now is it that the growing numbers of these refugees will cut down perhaps in the next 10 years, do you think?
It's hard to say, and as was discussed at the very beginning of the show, I mean, the prevalence of conflict and war, not just in Africa but in Syria and around the world, is devastating, and it represents a failure of the most powerful countries in the world to mitigate those failures, and so, or to mitigate those conflicts. And so if we can take steps to end those conflicts, then not only will there be a prevention of refugees fleeing their countries, but people who are already out of their country can start to go home. But unfortunately, given the current trends, I'm not very positive about that right now.
All right, let's leave it at that, and we hope that we have a positive outlook, well, sometime very soon. Mark Yarnell, Senior Advocate of Refugee International in the United States, thanks a lot for your analysis on the program.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Dokun, let's wrap it up. Looking at what he just analyzed so far, do you go by what he said?
I agree entirely with what Mark said.
Why?
You can't predict, believe me, with the level of what we're seeing around the world in terms of political differences and religious intolerance. It is not likely that we will see a diminution in the number of refugees until there is a global leadership determination, maybe United Nations or nations just coming on to terms with themselves and say, look, this is how far a nation should live, and this is the extent of the discipline that we should exact. Without that, it will be difficult. Because you see, look at Sudan. Sudan became independent within a year of independence, already going to a refugee crisis. Right now, they have massive outflow of the people into neighboring countries, Uganda, Burundi, and all the rest of it. And those in Africa, particularly in Africa, political differences, not much of maybe religious, but more political, and it's a failure of leadership. Until we can do that, contain those things, show a bit of discipline, leadership, and in political awareness and maturity, it will be difficult to predict.
And what do you think will be the likely implications if this goes out of hand?
The same thing will happen. Then becomes a massive influx into our neighboring countries, and what may then happen is there may then be conflicts within people. People normally that should just come in, and then the nationals of those countries then begin to feel a bit, hey, what is this? And then they begin to feel overwhelmed by the problems of other people, and then there is not enough resources within nations themselves to begin to cater for foreigners, it will get worse, and then it will make relationship worse. And I think Africa should begin to take responsibility for itself, because the way the world is going, with the new nationalism that is enveloping Europe, and then with America as intransigence, we may just run into a lot more trouble of resources, of help, and all the rest of it.
Perhaps this is a wake-up call for African leaders and as well African, regional blocs to provide for its own, that depend on the Western countries for donations.
Absolutely. What is beginning to happen is that the outflow from other countries to Africa is reducing. And if there is not enough money to cater to help, it will be difficult for African nations themselves to. It's not that Africa does not have enough resources to take care of its people, but the kind of leadership we have and the kind of disturbances that we see generally in Africa makes it difficult for them to be able to harness those resources to be used appropriately for their own people.
But there is a possibility with the younger generation, don't you think?
I hope so. I want to believe so.
Is that cynicism or
no, it's not about
sarcasm?
If you look at what is happening, if you look at the way the youth themselves are beginning to get disenfranchised and also to get disoriented as to what the future holds for them, and until, for me, for instance, in Nigeria, I've said to a number of young people, they hold the future of this country in their hands if they can just get themselves together and then work towards. The total population of Nigeria is about 170. Out of that, over 65%, close to 70, youth. They can make a president if they choose to, if they work together. And then they can have a plan for the future with the experience of hindsight to say this is the kind of future we want for our country. I hope we can.
And we will. We will. Thanks a lot to Dokun Adedeji, a public media consultant. We appreciate your analysis on Africa today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Now, as the world pushes towards a better life for all, Africa continues to play catch-up, especially with the plight of refugees under conditions where institutions are weak, infrastructure is degrading, and investment is poor. Now, amidst a senseless campaign of brutality, displacing lives and destroying livelihoods, the future of the continent largely depends on purpose-driven, forward-thinking leadership where hope is more than a word and peace is more than a wish. Well, that is our package for today, but don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC Connect, and also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Mokmariola, and always remember, this is Africa. Bye for now.